Hi, everyone. It's me, Sanam Nariandolini, the co-host of If You Were in Charge, our podcast about people, power, and possibilities. I'm really excited because this week we have a bonus episode from a partner organization. It's the podcast Disrupting Peace that is hosted by Bridget Connolly. She is the research director of the World Peace Foundation, and they're affiliated with Tufts. And the reason why I'm really excited about this particular episode is that they're looking at the problem of white extremist supremacy and how it can be stopped, which is obviously a little challenge that we have right now in the Western world and in the United States. For me, it's very resonant with the work that we do at ICANN on extremism writ large and the gender dimensions of it, and actually how women around the world are leading the charge in terms of coming up with positive solutions to de-radicalization, prevention, and so forth. So I'm really excited that we are hearing from Bridget and her guests about this problem in the US and how others are taking charge to solve a big problem. We will be back next week with our usual programming, and our guest next week is going to be Raffaella Bollini. She's an Italian activist, and we wanted to host her in honor of May Day and the whole question of what happens when people take the power and fight for social justice for everyone. So come back next week and find us, as you do every time, on all the platforms where podcasts are hosted right now. Thank you.
Welcome to Disrupting Peace, a show about why peace hasn't worked and how it still could. I'm Bridget Conley, Research Director at the World Peace Foundation. This season, we're asking how we can dismantle the myths and misinformation that get in the way of achieving peace. Because we can't move towards peace if we don't have a clear picture of what's actually happening. In previous episodes, we've looked at misinformation and targeting journalists as things that prevent accurate information from reaching the public. Today, we're exploring the beliefs that make people willing to commit violence and what can change their minds. Specifically, we're focusing on violent white supremacy. To learn more, I'm speaking with Pete Simi and Sarah Weininger-Budge. Pete Simi is a professor of sociology at Chapman University and an expert on extremist groups and violence in the U.S. Among his many publications, he is co-author of American Swastika, Inside the White Power Movement's Hidden Spaces of Hate, which is in its third edition. Sarah Weininger-Budge holds a doctorate in psychology and is a licensed psychologist in Oregon. She's the director of U.S. programs at Moonshot, which builds technology to identify and disrupt organized crime, child sexual exploitation, and trafficking, among other forms of abuse and violence. Her clinical work focuses on individuals who are or have been involved in violent extremism. Together, we'll discuss what happens when extremism becomes mainstream, what lures people into these groups, and why they might reconsider. This conversation was recorded in February 2026. Sarah, Pete, welcome to Disrupting Peace.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you for having us.
To set the stage, I want to start with just 4 short, quick-fire questions. You can respond with true or false, and this is for either of you. Okay, point number 1. White supremacy is a largely fringe rural problem.
False.
False.
Okay. Point number 2. All white supremacist movements are violent.
False.
False.
Okay. 3. Once someone adopts a far-right ideology, their ability to assess facts is adversely altered.
True.
True temporarily.
Interesting.
But also, I would say we are all capable of misinterpreting facts. And we all interpret information through pre-existing confirmation biases.
Yeah.
So I think there's more nuance to that.
Absolutely.
Okay, the last one. People who become involved in supremacist groups never leave them or change their worldviews.
False.
Very
much
false.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for engaging in this quick fire round. So now we'll slow down a little bit. And I wanted to ask Pete, why did you choose to study the far right?
Well, I've been doing this since 1996. So this was shortly after the Oklahoma City bombing, 168 Americans killed in a mass casualty act of violence. And at the time, it was the, single most lethal act of domestic terrorism. And for a long time, the long history of white supremacist violence in our country's history, the problem's been kind of minimized. And so I wanted to understand, the central role, but also why it had been treated as kind of more of a peripheral issue and not a central issue in our country. And that even became, I'd say, more of the case after 9/11, where really the word terrorism became synonymous with Islamic extremism, and far-right extremism really became even less emphasized and minimized.
Right, so that only certain ideologies or certain acts of violence are treated as serious expressions of ideology. Is that sort of the problem?
Yeah, I think that is a big part of the problem. Terrorism is a very charged term. It's a very loaded term, and it gets deployed in very inconsistent and selective ways. And one of the ways that it's been deployed is, to a large extent, to ignore this type of domestic, long-standing white supremacist violence that, again, has such a long history in our country.
And Sarah, what drew you to the work of helping people exit these types of hate groups?
I've always been interested in extreme human behavior, and in particular, as a clinician, trying to understand the reasons and the ways that we harm others and the impact it has on those that we harm. I really felt like that's the responsibility of someone with my skills and training and experience to try to understand, how does somebody get to the point where they might want to kill others simply because of some real or perceived part of their identity.
Yeah. So, Pete, what does extremism mean in today's context?
Oh, well, in today's context is an important qualifier because certainly the term has always been contested, right? It's always had, dozens and dozens of different definitions. It's even tougher to define today than, say, 10 years ago. And I say that because of the way in which it's become normalized and mainstream within U.S. society. And I think when you look at the current federal administration and its relationship to extremism, the way in which that has become so deeply intertwined in a way that's quite different than certainly recent presidential administrations, that really makes defining the term extremism far more complicated. Because you have, some of the highest levers of power that are expressing ideas and emotions and practices, quite frankly, that are indistinguishable from what we've generally looked at in the realm of extremism.
Could you share some specific examples?
So, Trump on many occasions has referenced ideas related to the Great Replacement. He refers to immigration as an invasion. Of course, Trump posted a meme that depicts Barack Obama and Michelle Obama as apes. And of course, the depiction of Black people as apes is a long-standing kind of white supremacist trope in their propaganda. Of course, he famously, in his first term, referred to Haiti and other so-called non-white countries, African countries, as shithole countries. That's a term you'll readily see on white supremacist web forums.
And so why are these far-right and white supremacist ideologies attractive to some people? Like, what is the draw?
Oh gosh, I think it's very complicated and it is individualized, but I think the appeal is that they satisfy some kind of basic unmet need for this person. It's not unlike all of our needs. We all have a need to feel important, to feel special, to feel like we belong. Some people satisfy these needs through pro-social outlets. They might be engaging in religious communities, volunteerism. They might be getting these needs for meaning and belonging met by family and other pro-social groups. Some people are not getting those needs met through these pro-social means and outlets, and that creates this openness in some people to uptaking these violent extremist beliefs. And importantly, there's some kind of environmental exposure to those beliefs.
I think that availability issue is so important. It speaks to our historical DNA in terms of the U.S. society. And, of course, the state that Sarah and I come from, Oregon, that came into the Union as a whites-only territory. right? It's baked into the cake, these ideologies in many respects. The number of sundown towns that existed across the United States, not people often will associate, Jim Crow segregation exclusively with the former Confederacy, but of course it extended across the country.
Can you just briefly say what a sundown town is?
So sundown towns were towns that existed across the United States where basically they either explicitly would have signs designating the town as whites only after sundown, and they would often be signs that were riddled with racial slurs about, N-word, don't let the sun set on your rear end, basically. Now, they didn't always have those signs, but informally it was well known that this was the case. And to violate that type of a code could mean that, a person could be murdered and certainly violently attacked at a minimum. So this is, something we have to reckon with as a society, and we've really struggled to honestly reckon with it. And one of the consequences of not reckoning with it is it means you have this ready availability of these kind of ideologies.
And I know some of your research traces the flow between fringe and mainstream movements, but what today are the primary recruitment pathways for people who become involved in violent right-wing extremist groups?
There's not one single, pathway. There's not one single profile. There's some different online subcultures that provide pathways of sorts. But you also have offline pathways. So, for instance, the mixed martial arts community, which is not exclusively white supremacists, but you have some groups that are explicitly white supremacists that organize around mixed martial arts, and they call themselves active clubs. And they're using this kind of athletic, hyper-masculine, tough culture to try and attract folks and bring them in, if not for the purpose of the ideology, but really for the purpose of the training and the opportunity to engage in this kind of athleticism, but also the camaraderie that goes along with it and the expression of masculinity. So, those are a few examples. I'm sure Sarah maybe add a few more.
Yes, Sarah, what pathways do you see in your work?
Actually, what I would expand on what Pete is saying and actually clarify one thing. We know that mere exposure to these belief systems is not sufficient for uptake. I mean, if that were the case, Pete and I would be radicalized many times over. So we know that there has to be that motivational component or that receptivity to it. And so there's this serendipitous exposure. There's a curiosity and an openness. Many of the people that I work with have actually been exposed online. They may have run across content that begins to give them hints of the ideas of these ideologies. They become exposed to ever more extremist content as they move further into the internet, essentially, of either algorithmic exposure, the algorithm suggests another interesting video that you might like, or they start actively seeking out particular influencers who might share similar messages. In an offline context, it could look very similar. It may be that the initial exposure is through a social community who just also happens to share a particular belief system. So as Pete is talking about the active clubs, there might be somebody who's looking for some kind of fitness outlet and a social outlet, and then they're also then exposed to these belief systems.
Pete, is there anything you'd like to add?
In terms of recruitment, one of the things you see among white supremacist groups and the propaganda and the narratives is that they're really trying to capitalize on a sense of guilt that a young white male may feel because of their status and the privileges historically that have been accorded to white males in U.S. society. And for a young white male that's kind of coming of age, trying to figure out who they are, they may get certain messages that may feel like they should feel bad about who they are because of that history. And that can be really uncomfortable and can be really troubling for a young person. And then to get a message of, you didn't do anything. Don't let them tell you to feel bad about being who you are. You should feel proud about who you are. And here's a group that can give you that sense of support and a sense of feeling positive about being a young white male. And so you see that kind of messaging pretty common and can be a pretty attractive and alluring set of messages and feelings in terms of trying to offset those struggles that they might be having emotionally.
Also, when people are experiencing social rejection in the real world, these online communities and parasocial relationships really offer them answers and belonging. And those same messages about what makes you special and important are readily available in these communities. And so now you not only get these messages about you're special, you're important, there's something, in fact, more special about you than others, and you belong to this greater collective, this greater group of us who know this about the world. It's a really powerful mix for folks that are having a hard time engaging socially in the offline world.
Is there a critical threshold that people pass when they're willing to commit acts of violence in the name of an ideology? Like, do we know how many groups actually commit acts of violence?
Well, look, what we know about violent groups, and this certainly is true for white supremacist groups, and it's true more broadly for violent groups, is that the violence is actually probably a relatively small portion. If you were to look at the behavior of the most violent street gangs, you would find that that would primarily consist of things like watching TV, hanging out with friends, maybe drinking, using drugs, so forth and so on. The violence is actually a small portion if you look at it from that perspective. That's kind of the million-dollar question is how does a group or individual who is promoting violence but not actively engaged in violence, how do they get from the promotion or the endorsement to the actual commission? And, I think a number of factors are important. We can look at the extent to which dehumanization becomes normalized and a very pervasive way to look at individuals and other groups. And the more that dehumanization sets in, that can certainly be something that helps facilitate actual commissions of violence. And how do we monitor without violating people's constitutional rights? Because, we're also talking about some important constitutional protections about people being able to believe things that are, quite horrific in many respects, and even say things that are quite horrific. And as long as there's not a criminal threat in what they're saying, then we have a very high threshold for protecting some of the most egregious speech.
In my field, which I've done a lot of work on mass atrocities and genocide, and then more recently on mass incarceration. But, what are the triggers for this kind of extraordinary organized violence against civilians? And, one of them is the context of armed conflict, right? Where that inhibition against perpetrating violence is already lowered. Right, it's much more permissive environment, and then people are able to channel it against people who've been, like you've said, dehumanized or described as if they were less than everyone else, which is interesting to look at. Some of those dynamics are similar, but in a context where we haven't had a war on our territory.
But that is an important point because you see in their ideology and their propaganda, they're trying to create the sense that there is a war. And so among white supremacists, they're really focused on the idea that whites are under attack. The whites are on the verge of extinction. There's a genocidal assault that's being committed against the white race. It's happening here in the United States. It's happening across Europe. There will not be a white race in the near future if this assault continues. And so they use a lot of language to try and set the stage that there is actually an ongoing conflict. And so you do need to understand that. And part of what they're offering is this special insight that they claim most people aren't able to see what's actually happening before their eyes, and that they provide that special insight in order for people to fully appreciate and understand that they are under attack. And so words like invasion become, very common in their propaganda, which is why it's even more troubling to see those very same terms show up in government communication today in the current administration, where the term invasion now is routinely being used to describe immigration by the federal government.
Yeah.
My experience, of course, and my focus is working at the individual level and thinking about how do we understand when somebody might be considering or engaging in violence. And when we're looking at people's movement toward violence, I'm considering whether there's a group influence, group extremity shift in the ways, the poor ways we make decisions as humans and groups sometimes. But also at the individual level, we're looking at, as Pete said, that justification of violence. Is there a particular target? Am I hearing things like a sense of time urgency or last resort speech. So these are some of the ways, though, that these bigger cultural movements and that authorities are spreading messages that we have a time urgency, that violence is the only option, that can frame the right cultural context for an individual then to adopt that belief system. So as I'm assessing potential for premeditated violence in particular, I'm listening again for that justification of violence. Is there a specific target or group of people that they think is justified to commit violence against? And am I hearing some of that time urgency and that last resort speech? There is no other option. This is the only thing we can do. Not only is violence justified, violence is necessary.
As you noted in the beginning, there's a lot of selectivity about what people believe within any framework, and what counts as truth. But I'm just curious on your thoughts on how the way we think, how our worldview or ideology changes what we can receive as factual information.
In many ways, the belief systems, they're a filter through which people see something, a filter and a focus. Information that does not fit with that may be discarded, and information that does might be held. And it is also an oversimplification to say that everyone who's engaging with these beliefs is that fully committed to the belief and unable to receive contradictory information. This is going to be very individualized. It depends on the level of commitment to that belief system, how much of an identity they've taken on as a member of this movement, how much it has infused everything about who they are, their social networks, and so on. So some people are more peripherally involved. They may actually be able to almost lead dual lives, where there is an online life, an online self that's very much involved in a white supremacist movement, but an offline self that is inhibiting expression of that for a variety of reasons. And it may be that there's more permeability when you have a more varied identity, so that you've got maybe an extremist self and a non-extremist self. So there's that individual variability and that ability to hear contradictory beliefs. And a lot of Pete's research, and Pete should speak to this, is in people who are exiting, who seem to have been deeply committed to a belief system, and then were exposed to contradictory ideas, to experiences that conflicted with their belief system, their experience of the world, that really shifted their frame. So I think it's tempting to assume that that ability to hear contradictory information or to hear factual information as factual is completely shut down. But I think there is still that availability, perhaps some permeation of factual information, even if it doesn't appear to be permeating from an outside view.
So what are some examples of conflicting experiences that might shift someone's perspective?
Yes, yeah. So we have lots of testimonials from individuals who've ultimately talked about someone who they would have otherwise dehumanized and seen as worthy of violence, actually treating them with compassion. Multiple individuals I've worked with had been violently attacked themselves, often by members of their own movement or by rival movements, and received medical treatment from someone who was a part of that outgroup that they would have otherwise assumed to be the enemy, and have to deal with that dissonance of, this is somebody that I see as the enemy, and here they are showing me compassion. Similarly, many people have talked about having positive pro-social relationships with people from an outgroup, a perceived outgroup, and really having that challenge their experience and their belief systems.
Thank you. Going back, Pete, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how ideology changes what we can receive as factual information.
Yeah, on the ideology part, I would add that, there's kind of a learning curve that's involved. And the ideology is providing a type of process for people to learn about things like international Jewish conspiracy that prior to being exposed to the ideology, oftentimes the individuals that, we've interviewed say they weren't aware of or had never really heard about that. They do typically describe being pretty well-versed in anti-Black racism before exposure to the ideology, but anti-Semitism tends to be something less often that folks are familiar with. And one of the things, though, that people will say sometimes is that, even years of involvement, I never did fully get the whole anti-Semitic part. I never really did fully buy into the Hitler stuff. I tried to read Mein Kampf and, I couldn't get beyond a few pages. So there's an interesting aspect for some folks that even though they're immersed in it and they have picking up some aspects of this learning process, it may not be fully successful. So that's, I think, an important piece. And of course, that has implications then for disengagement and for those folks that start to see things that maybe are contradictory or inconsistent. If they never did fully embrace it to begin with, obviously it's going to be a little more likely that those inconsistencies will rub them the wrong way and potentially start to unleash a process where they move away from the ideology, oftentimes, fairly gradually.
I think this is a great chance to talk about the difference between beliefs and practices. And so often you'll be seeing somebody who may be engaging overtly in what look like all of the practices of white supremacy, but may not necessarily have fully adopted the beliefs and identity. And vice versa. You may have somebody who has fully adopted beliefs and identity, but may not be engaging in the practices of violent far-right extremism or white supremacy.
Yeah. Pete, can I ask you, most of the work of yours that I've read was really focused on right wing. How would you characterize differences between left wing and right wing extremist groups?
One of the things we see in comparing far left and far right as it relates to violence specifically is that there is some element within far left kind of extremist culture to essentially try and reduce the degree to which the violence is lethal and or personally injurious. For instance, and not always, but certainly within some of the kind of far left culture of violence, they'll do surveillance, for instance. And if they're planning to, say, attack, bomb an animal, a laboratory at a university, they may do surveillance to try and ensure that the building's empty at the time that they plan to detonate the explosives, so as to not harm any individuals and just destroy property. And so there is, I would say, more of a focus on property destruction than personal harm. Whereas with the far right, you see quite the opposite. The idea is to have as high a body count essentially as possible. And lethal violence, whether interpersonal in terms of a single individual attacking one or more people, or a more kind of mass casualty act of violence like a shooting rampage or like a bombing like the Oklahoma City bombing, where you're trying to really kill as many people as possible. We've also found an interesting difference in terms of adverse childhood experiences in comparing the kind of childhood and adolescent backgrounds of left-wing extremists and right-wing extremists. Both tend to have, higher than kind of average levels of adverse childhood experiences. But on the right, we tend to see a greater number and a greater intensity. So, with some of the folks on the far right, for instance, the experience with child abuse, it ends up being really horrific stuff not in all cases, obviously. I mean, child abuse is always horrific, but we're talking about in some cases actually something might be more accurately described as torture. And we just don't see that same level of intensity in terms of the adverse childhood experiences with left-wing extremists.
That's a really shocking finding.
I don't know if this is of interest, but it is also not uncommon when people are exiting far-right movements to swing toward the far left. So I actually don't know, Pete, if there's literature on this, but at least practice-based experience is that as people are exiting one extremist movement or one extreme behavior, they may adopt a different extreme practice, a different extreme belief system, and it is not uncommon for them to swing to a far left. I think the defining difference in the beliefs is the difference between a supremacist or an oppressive belief system and a liberationist belief system.
Pete, this might be a provocative question, but I'm curious if it is possible, do you think, or is it accurate to say that the federal immigration forces deployed to American cities are acting as an alt-right armed militia loyal to the executive office? And I'm asking because I know that ICE has used a lot of language in their recruitment materials that's directly lifted from white nationalist songs, text, tracks, memes, and it seems unclear if there's a sense of loyalty except to just the executive office.
Yeah, that is provocative. Um, but I unfortunately wouldn't disagree.
Okay.
I think you see in the social media feed of ICE and other, it's not just ICE either. We're seeing from the Department of Labor that a slogan that was eerily similar to a Nazi slogan. And, a lot of the things that ICE is posting, there is some built-in kind of what we call plausible deniability that allows them to say, well, for instance, there's a post where they posted an image of Uncle Sam, and then there's Which Way American Man. Well, Which Way Western Man is the name of a neo-Nazi book that was published by the neo-Nazi organization, the National Alliance, in the 1970s, and it's kind of a popular book among white supremacists. So, DHS can say, well, we didn't say Which Way Western Man, we said Which Way American Man. So there's plausible deniability there, but it's quite a coincidence. And when you couple that, if that was the only thing, then you might say, well, maybe it is an odd coincidence. But of course, you couple it with a lot of the other imagery that they're posting and other statements that they're posting and videos and so forth. What is very clear is that they are really promoting a hyper-aggressive set of kind of beliefs that involve the idea that there's an existential threat that this country is facing. It's on the verge of collapse. They're going to steal your country, and they mean immigrants who are coming here illegally to take your culture, to take your country. And if you don't do something about it, and it does require aggressive action, then you're going to lose everything. And so that is a message that certainly is very comparable to what described earlier in terms of what white supremacists are trying to communicate. And certainly you do see very aggressive action on the streets of places like Minneapolis and Chicago and Los Angeles and other places across the country. And you do see officers who are masked, which is a whole interesting element to when we talk about violent groups. One of the things we know from research is that if you take two violent groups, one masked and one unmasked, the masked violent group will tend to be more violent. And that's because of the importance of obviously concealing your identity, which is part of potentially avoiding, culpability, responsibility. But there's a psychological aspect that Sarah's well versed in as well, which is the anonymity that the mask provides and the extent to which that can disinhibit someone and make it easier to be more aggressive and to be more violent and inflict harm on other people. And of course, we have a tradition of law enforcement and policing where officers are not masked. Obviously, it's officers in some cases who are Black, who are Latino, and white, and other racial and ethnic backgrounds. But to see them masked and acting in such an aggressive manner in a way that does bear some certainly resemblance to history of masked white supremacist violent groups is troubling, to say the least. And again, I think you have to put it in the larger context of the administration. So I take the provocative question and unfortunately have to say I think there's definitely a there.
I was hoping you'd tell me there were major differences. But I do think the threat is real, and we have to look at it without, sort of soft filter around. Sarah, I wanted to get back to you and to that question of how people leave these groups. So can you tell us about why people leave? And just frankly, is there anything that those of us who would like to see more people leave, is there any way to support, to keep that door open for people to leave these hate groups?
Yes, absolutely. So what often begins is this sense of disillusionment. They're disillusioned with the group. They're disillusioned with the social relationships that they have. They may be disillusioned with the ideology. And there is the seed of doubt that is planted, and people begin to consider, are there other ways that I might want to live in the world? I will say from my own practice-based experience, what I see is really it's consequences. That individuals experiencing personal consequences as a result of their involvement that are not tolerable to them. So if we start by imagining that people become part of these movements because it's satisfying some kind of need, and they stay in these movements because, again, it's satisfying these many needs, at some point, if it's no longer satisfying those needs, or if the consequences are outweighing those satisfied needs, they begin to think about, why might I want to leave? Or what might I do? What might it look like on the other side of this? And then this disengagement and reimagining self-process of figuring out who am I, what do I believe, can be a very extensive amount of time. And it seems to be commensurate, proportionate to about the amount of time that somebody was involved in the movement.
What are some examples of the consequences that you referred to?
Yeah, so the consequences that people find intolerable are really variable. Some people are being rejected by family members. Some people have either lost a job or are concerned about losing employment as a result of their involvement. For some people, the fear of being doxxed or of having their personal information shared with the public and their role or involvement in a movement is enough. That fear of that consequence is enough. For others, however, it's important to note that who have been doxxed, this becomes a license to then engage in even more problematic behavior. There is nothing left to lose. Everybody knows what I'm doing and who I'm involved with. I might as well carry it out. So I want to be careful to suggest doxing isn't an appropriate consequence that always results in someone's disengagement from a movement. In other cases, it is actually the consequence of being involved in a behavior that they even find has gone too far. I've spoken with quite a few individuals who, for them, the tipping point was actually engaging in violence. And that once they had actually committed an act of harm towards someone physically, that was the moment that they realized they had crossed a line that they never wanted to cross again. So part of what people need and part of what we can do to encourage people to leave, one, is for there to be some appropriate consequences for them and for us to create the space for people to change. And I think on the other side of that is this idea of compassion with accountability. You're accountable for your actions. You're accountable for the harms you may have caused. But we also are willing to see you as a person. As I often like to say, dehumanizing the dehumanizer is not helping. It's not helping us, and it's not helping them. And that's a difficult balance because some people have done some really awful things. Some people have committed some really horrendous atrocities. And so I don't want to say this to suggest that they should not be held accountable for that. We should just forget and excuse. But there does need to be some compassion and new pathways for belonging and identity and pro-social lives on the other side of engagement.
And I'm sorry, I'm feeling really emotional. I don't know how I forgot in setting up this interview. I worked at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum when we had a white nationalist kill one of our security guards who'd been working at the front door. I can't believe I forgot about that. I just suddenly was like, oh my God. I mean, like somebody I knew really well, it was, anyway, I completely forgot about it until just now. You sometimes do that segment.
Yeah.
Parts, but it was terrifying for everyone.
Yes.
And painful.
Yes.
Yeah. And, he was an anti-Semitic person, obviously. But, the man who was working the front door was black and went to hold the door open for him. And the guy pulled out a gun and just started shooting. Yeah. I mean, it was devastating.
And the shooter was an elderly.
Yeah. That's why he held the door for him.
Yeah. He had been involved for multiple decades.
Yeah. Yeah, but when you were talking about consequences, though, I know his family completely disowned him. And I'm sure it pained his family terribly to see.
Yes.
But obviously nowhere near as much as the family that lost
Of course.
They're young. Yeah.
Right. And our consequences need to be commensurate with the action, with the harm that's caused. And I actually, Bridget, I'm glad that you said this, and I'm so sorry you experienced that. I'm so sorry for the family who lost a loved one, for all of you, for our community as humans. And I would say, when we're talking about creating space for people to exit, meeting them with that compassion and accountability, we need to think about who is the right person to do that. And not everybody is meant to be doing that. It is not everybody's responsibility to be doing that. And I want to be really clear. I do not think that if you are the person who has suffered harm as a result of white supremacy, that you are necessarily responsible for correcting that harm, for creating that space for somebody to experience compassion with accountability. It can be very powerful. Many people feel called to do that, and I support that, but I certainly would never suggest that everyone should be creating that space for somebody to learn not to be a white supremacist.
So, Sarah, on a more day-to-day level, when we hear someone, it's a friend, a family member, a neighbor, say something that seems to be reinforcing white supremacist values, what are some ways to engage with those statements that you think could maybe result in a positive impact instead of, building up more walls between people?
That's a great question. And the first thing I would suggest is you consider the strength of the relationship and the nature of the relationship you have with that person. Is this someone that is going to be receptive to you, maybe gently challenging their beliefs? And that should be the first question, because in general, that isn't the first step we want to take. The first thing we say shouldn't be, "You're wrong, and let me tell you all the reasons you're wrong." Often people are thinking more emotionally than rationally when they make these statements. And so I think it's more important to try to understand where they're coming from. Reading between the lines and behind the kind of statement to really understand how they've come to believe that. It's very, very challenging. And I don't want to minimize that it's hard when someone has said something really, really offensive to you and your hackles go up. But the most important thing you can do is take a breath and just start with, "That's really interesting. I'd love to learn more about that. You must have some experience that is informing this belief." And that just creates that openness for you to tell me about it. But you notice that my tone is very careful. It's meant to be an open tone, not, "Wow, you must really have some experiences that suggest that that's a correct belief." You really need to be in the right state to engage and understand why they might have come to this belief. And it's possible that just that kind of dialogue is enough to move the needle, to get somebody to stop and to question those beliefs. But I think it's critical that you stop and say, do I have the kind of relationship with this person where I can have this conversation? And am I in the right mental and emotional state to have that kind of conversation right now?
If I may add, I have family members that have promoted QAnon ideas and Stop the Steal ideas and believe that the 2020 election was rigged, and the FBI, the deep state, anti-immigration beliefs and so forth, and have even posted, in one case, neo-Nazi propaganda on Facebook. And, it's been very difficult and strained the relationships in lots of ways. And so I would just underscore that it's not easy, even the best circumstances, as someone, very familiar with the ideologies and has, a lot of experience talking with both current and former adherents. When it's family, it does change dynamics. And I do think we have to, on some level, accept the possibility that even with the best techniques and the best approach, it doesn't necessarily guarantee anything in terms of what you're hoping for. It may be that that's just not in the cards, so to speak.
Yeah. We always try to end on a slightly more positive note if we can. And I wanted to give the two of you a last question. It's kind of a two-part question. And so part one is, what's one thing that we could do better over the next year to reduce the impact of violent extremism in the U.S.?
Well, I would say that there's a lot of opportunities right now. There's a lot of people who are very rightfully so fearful, scared, feeling very vulnerable. Right now, we're, I would say, on a precipice. I don't think that's an exaggeration. And so one thing would be an affirmative act to align ourselves with individuals, groups, and communities that are often the target of white supremacists and far-right ideologies, including right now our federal government.
Yeah. Sarah, what's one thing that you think we can do?
Vote. In addition, I think as individuals, we all can take a moment and reflect on the times when it's easy for us to other and recognize that othering people, seeing them as different than us, and then that next step of seeing them as less than us is actually very, very easy for us to do as humans. We are all doing it at all times. And if we can catch ourselves in that moment of othering and stop and ask ourselves, what is the impact of my othering this person, both on them and on myself? We can take that moment to just check our own dehumanization of others and think about how we might reach across the divide with someone who ostensibly seems very different than us and understand them. Doesn't mean we have to agree with them, but just try to understand at a genuine level their experience and their perception of the world, because that in itself is an incredibly powerful intervention.
And then the second part of the question is, what could we do over the next, say, 20, 30, 40 years to get rid of violent extremism?
Well, yeah, I don't necessarily know that it's a realistic goal to completely remove the problem of violent extremism. But I would say, in the big picture over a longer haul, one of the things that needs to happen is a true embrace of a truth and reconciliation approach to addressing our country's history, the consequences of that history, how it informs the present, and really trying to honestly have some conversations and dialogue and more proactive measures. North Carolina, a number of years back, had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to deal with a violent white supremacist Klan killing that involved killing 5 anti-Klan protesters in Greensboro, North Carolina in the late 70s. So there have been some of those types of efforts here in the U.S., but certainly nothing on a more broader kind of national scale that I think is what's required for us to really sink into where we've been and where we are now and how we can chart a different path forward.
Yeah. Sarah, you get the last word.
We really need to infuse social emotional learning, emotion regulation, social problem solving skills, healthy relationship skills as a primary prevention activity that I do think would make a dent in many of the individuals who have become involved in violent extremism, the things that made them vulnerable to that. We have that potential to make a difference if we really bring social emotional learning into all of our children's lives. Similarly, it's all of the primary prevention that we do related to trauma and adverse childhood experiences and all of the other problematic things that we know lead to other public health concerns. We just really need to fund and facilitate those public health prevention initiatives.
Thank you both. This is an incredibly helpful interview, so thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
I want to conclude by honoring the memory of my former colleague at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, Stephen Tyrone Johns, who was killed by a white supremacist on June 10th, 2009. We will include a link in our show notes to the museum's website for more information about him, and you can also contribute to a fund in his name. I don't need to tell you that today far-right extremism is on the rise around the world and in the U.S. It can be easy to fall into despair, but there is at least one hopeful takeaway from this conversation. Even people who adopt really extreme beliefs can still change. So I'll leave you today with these lines from a song I heard Minnesota protesters singing. It's okay to change your mind. Show us your courage. Leave this behind. Thanks for listening to Disrupting Peace. I'm Bridget Conley. You can find out more about Pete Simi and Sarah Weiniger-Budge, as well as the Stephen Tyrone Johns Memorial page at the links in our show notes. Next week on Disrupting Peace, we explore what the climate movement can teach us about combating misinformation.
The way that it started was through getting into arguments with my father-in-law. So we would have family get-togethers. He would start throwing these arguments about how climate change was a conspiracy or it wasn't real. And my initial motivation was, I don't want to lose an argument with my father-in-law. And being an Uber nerd, I started creating a database of all the potential arguments that I might hear and what the peer-reviewed science said about each one.
Disrupting Peace is a production of the World Peace Foundation. Find out more at worldpeacefoundation.org. You can also find us on Instagram and TikTok at WorldPeaceFDTN. This show is produced by myself and Emily Shaw. Engineering by Jacob Winnick and Asia Simpson. Marketing and social media by Kaylin Song. Show artwork by Simon Fung. This season was partially funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Special thanks to my colleagues, Lisa Avery and Alex Duvall, and the team from the Tufts Digital Design Studio. Okay, until next time, stay skeptical and hopeful.